one of the neatest things about watching kids grow up is that we get to see all of these really fascinating changes happen in their brains. And it's not just the connections in the brain that are so interesting, but that the brains are actively growing and reaching adult capacity. We have evolution to thank for this. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit about the brain growth spurts. And there won't be much time to talk about anything else, but this will at least give you an idea of where the brain is really hopping, and where we might expect to see some disruptions in thought and behavior because of that. So because of evolution, we are walking on two legs, and that means that the birth canal, the pelvic opening that we have, is quite a bit smaller than it would be if we were on four legs. And that means that when babies are born, they need to have brains and skulls that are able to fit through that, which means that they've got to be quite a bit smaller than adult size. So you see other animals, other four-legged mammals that are squeezing out babies, and within 2 hours those babies are standing up and running around, and they're not moving beautifully, but they're moving. That's because they have bigger spaces to come from relative to mom's size, and they can come out with bigger brains. Humans can't do that. So a baby who is born full term has a brain size that's about 30% of an adult brain size. Now, this is not 30% of capability. This is sheer volume, sheer volume. By the end of toddlerhood, so about the 3-year period-ish, it's different for everybody, but that brain is going to grow to about 70% the size of an adult brain. And that's a fantastic amount of growth in a really short period of time. So that's why we're seeing so much brain growth, and that's why people talk about those early years, the first 2 years, the first 3 years, as being absolutely critical and magical time. The brain is doing a lot of stuff. So it's not simply working on the connections between things and developing meaning, it's actively building structures. It's under construction. And that's very cool. So I have some notes down here on my desk that I'm going to be looking at. I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right information when I get excited about stuff, and you may have noticed that when I talk about these things, I am excited. I'm in an arousal state, as we would say in psychology. And sometimes then the connection between my brain and my mouth does not work as well as I would like it to. So I'm going to read and make sure that I give you the very best stuff. So if we're talking about the growth spurts that are in the brain, in that first 2 to 3 years, we have a lot of them. In 3 to 4 months, we're going to see a bit of an explosion, and that's when infants are typically beginning to reach for objects that they're grabbing, and they're learning that they have control over their hands. So they're really working on some of that motor development. And then around 8 months, there's going to be another surge when they start to crawl around and they're actively seeking. They have a new kind of seeking behavior that they really weren't able to develop before because they couldn't get around by themselves. And now that they have the power of locomotion, however slow and awkward it may be, they can see something across the room and say, ooh, that interests me. I'm going to go check that out. And when I get there, I'm going to grab it and I'm going to experience it. And I'm going to taste it and smell it and put it in my mouth and rub it on things. And so we're also seeing a lot of, throughout infanthood, we're seeing a lot of development in the sensory cortex when we're taking in information about things that we see and things that we hear and that we touch. All of that stuff. So then the next big growth period is roughly at 12 months in the brain. And that's when we may start to see some language, and we may start to see these babies transition to an upright state. So they're standing, they may be taking some steps. And that's another advancement in locomotion. So they are going to have even more freedom and more access to reach the things that they really want to. And this is where they start realizing that they can that they're seeing that they're separate people from their parents, that they're not part of this dynamic duo or trio, that they have their own motivations and they have their own desires, and all of this is coming from the parts of the brain that are being developed, which is really fantastic. Now, at 18 months is when the first language explosion starts. And it's called a language explosion because it's when you experience it, it really does feel like an explosion. These kids are picking up like a dozen words a day easily. And they're just throwing them out there and using them all the time. And you're thinking, how the heck did you do that? If only adults could learn like that. This typically happens in the 18-month to 24, 30-month period. Somewhere around there, that language explosion is happening. And there's not enough time to get into the specifics about where this happens in the brain. But what is interesting to note is that, and I think that we see this the most in language, as parents and as adults, quite frankly, we have this tendency to think that we need to teach children, that we actively need to teach them, that we need to have lessons, that we need to have curriculum. And yes, we do for some things, but when it comes to something like language, children prove to us time and time again, they are wired to learn. That is what they are designed to do because it's evolutionarily appropriate for them to do that. Children pick up language not because we sit down with them and teach them, because they watch us, because they're taking in what we say, because they're taking in that information and they're not simply duplicating it and repeating it. They're not just mimicking. They're taking it in and processing it and figuring out how to sort out the different categories of things, what the rules must be, and then apply those rules. And this is where we start to see that really happening in speech, that in the early stages when children are forming sentences, we don't tell them about the rules of grammar, but they are choosing word order that makes sense most of the time. And once in a while they get it wrong because they are taking an inference that they have from one situation and applying it to a different situation where we have one of those notable grammatical exceptions to the rule. We see this a lot when we're talking about plural forms of words or early use of past tense, where children will do something simple like add an S to something to say that it's more than one when for that particular noun it doesn't work. Or adding an ed to something to signify past tense. This is what I did yesterday when the conjugation, the past tense form of that verb is actually something different. And it's not because we're sitting them down. It's because they're taking in all of this stuff, and that's the way that their brains are beautifully designed to work. So this is something to keep in mind as a parent. You don't have to sit your kids down and pump them full of information and direct stuff at them. Simply experiencing life with them by your side is enough in most cases for them to pick up what they need to know. It truly, truly is. And I just love watching that. It's so exciting. The next big thing, thank goodness, is frontal lobe development. And that occurs roughly, well, it kicks off between 3 to 6 years of age. Now, there are certain structures in the brain that come out fully developed. The amygdala, for example, everybody's best friend, the amygdala, which is a separate video in the Brainy Parents series, comes out at birth. In a full-term baby, it's ready to go. It's at adult capability and capacity. And that's because it's necessary for survival. The frontal lobe, however, is where we have the higher order reasoning, where we make decisions, we're very thoughtful and deliberative about things. We can anticipate what might happen in the future and make plans for that, contingencies, all of that kind of stuff, the heavy-duty thinking. And when we're looking at the handy-dandy brain model, if we have our brain stem here, and this is the middle part of the brain where the limbic system is in the amygdala, the frontal lobe is right down here, kind of along the fingernail area, and this is the neocortex or the cerebral cortex. It's the same thing. This is the wrinkly area that's on the outside of the brain. And so this part in here doesn't start developing in infants until 2 to 3 months after birth. Seriously, that like the structures aren't there until that period of time. There's no connections to make that kind of stuff possible. And this doesn't finish developing. It's not at full adult capacity until the early to mid 20s. So this 3 to 6 year period is a great big deal for parents and for kids, because this is the start where they really are looking at using some problem solving skills, and they're willing to consider different possibilities, and they can start seeing that. So this is a great time to invite them in to contribute to solving family problems and family discussions, and to helping them understand how they are accountable for their own behavior and what they can do to remedy some things that may have gone wrong. Let's see. So in middle childhood, which is about the ages of 6 to 10 or 11, roughly, we see a brain that's a lot calmer, because there aren't any huge cognitive leaps that are happening during that time. So it's at this time that kids seem to be more emotionally stable and more cognitively stable, which is a nice break for parents because it kicks up again. So we do see more frontal lobe growth spurts. There's one around the age of 9. There's one around the age of 12, 15, and then a great big one, the last one from 18 to 20. And each of those is going to be progressively more abstract. So we're starting with that 3 to 6 year period with being able to really look at problems and solve them and look at different options and possibilities. And in each of those growth spurt periods, the ability to create logic and reason and to think abstractly instead of just concretely, that's going to increase. So that is a wonderful thing and makes theoretical math so much easier. This is why we don't teach calculus to 8-year-olds. So those are really the big growth periods. Did I have any more notes? No. Those are the biggest growth spurts in the brain that are helpful for us to know about. And it is just like in growth spurts with physical stuff, where you're going to see, when there's a physical growth spurt, you're going to see an increase in appetite. You're probably going to see an increase in the need for sleep. You're going to see an increase in emotional instability because there's so much happening in the body that it's just a lot to take in. The same thing happens for the brain. So let's just go over the numbers again. So we're going to see 3 to 4 months is the first one. 8 months, 12 months, the period of about 18 to 24 months or 30 months, and then from ages 3 to 6, that's a really long one, I know, it's terrible. That's the one I'm in right now, we just started. And then again at 9, 12, 15, and then 18 to 20. Those are the ages where for most kids we're going to see the greatest amount of instability when it comes to cognition. And because there are so many things happening in the brain that time, it's likely that we will also see some instability in behavior, because how we think, of course, impacts how we behave. There's that big iceberg thing where we see behavior is the only thing on top of the water, and then underneath are the feelings and the beliefs and the thoughts that we have that make that behavior. So these things are all related. Just to give you a heads up on roughly when things happen in the brain, and these are just numbers. These are developmental milestones-ish. So your child will be earlier or later or right on the money. It doesn't matter. The point is that these things tend to happen in very predictable patterns, and so these patterns are going to apply in your family unless you have some very special circumstance that's related to a traumatic brain injury or something like that. And I hope this gives you a little bit of insight as to what's happening in your child's brain and that you can use it in good health.